Part of our history with this church deals with Brother Wesley, William Wesley Van Orsdale. Brother Van, as you can see, he was born a long time ago, 1848. He passed away in December of 1919. He was the Methodist circuit rider, started out here in this area. And the reason I have some of these photos is I'm doing this in about a month at the museum, and they wanted more with Brother Van involved. He aged a little bit like the rest of us. The first photograph on the left is him when he first came out in this part of the country. The last one was taken in 1919. It's the one that we have in the back of the church. So he was here a few years. He came out on the riverboat in 1876, got off 4th of July weekend in Fort Benton, held a service in one of the bars there. He got him to shut the bar down for a little bit, and that was his first service. He was in the Bannock area, in the Gold Rush area for most of those early years, and he wasn't up here until the 1880s and 90s in this area, and that's when his contact here. He met a lot of people in this area. Charles Russell, this painting's down in the museum in Great Falls. You see it displayed periodically there. And he became tremendous friends with a lot of the Blackfeet. And so that's where the connection with the Blackfeet Reservation is through Brother Van. It was established at that time, and in fact, the Methodist Church has a full section of land, 640 acres there at Browning, and that's where the parsonage for the Blackfeat Parish is located. It's just west of town there. And so that's, in fact, Brother Van told us basically as Methodists that helped take care of the Blackfeet tribe. And so that's that connection with the Blackfeet Parish that we've had over the years. So July 1st was his first service. Like I say, he spent most of his time in the early years down in the gold fields, but that was where the people were. And then later on, he became the equivalent of a district superintendent up here in this part of Montana. He was responsible for helping found over 100 churches in Montana, this one being one of them. 50 parsonages, getting parsonages for the pastors in the early days. Hospitals, Havre Deaconess Hospital, which is part of now Northern Montana Hospital. Great Falls, the Deaconess Hospital, it's Benefice now. The Deaconess Hospital in Bozeman is still goes by that name. The Billings Clinic was originally the Deaconess Hospital in Billings. Rocky Mountain College started out in Helena. After the earthquake in the 1930s, it moved to Billings and is now affiliated with the Presbyterians and the Episcopalian Church as well. So that was it. And Intermountain Home in Helena started out as a Deaconess Home for Children. And so a lot of institutions he had a lot of play with in getting them founded. So he was an interesting fellow. He had a stroke that eventually became his cause of his death here in Chinook. He was actually in Chinook at his office, which was in the Regal home on the second floor. They had a little spot for him, and he knew it. The end must have been close because he had all his Christmas cards printed up that fall with this heading saying, "My first Christmas in heaven." He died on December 19th. So, interesting fellow that way. If you want more information, here's the two books. They're great. Bob Lynn, this top one, Brother Van, Montana Pioneer Preacher, was the book he wrote. It's the second edition of the first one from the ground up. Bob Lind has a connection to this church. He was a member of this church when he went into ministry. He was a teacher at Chinook High School. He married Carol Dover. If that name sounds familiar to you. I ran into a guy by the name of Bob Lind when I was at Claremont one day. I was one of the greeters for the new students. And he comes up, and I told him who I was, where I was from, and he says, I know your church. I was baptized in it. In March of 1952, Bob Lind was baptized right up here. So, because his parents were members of this church, and it was prior to his father, Bob Lind Sr., going into the ministry. So, a lot of interesting connections. The Brother Van house in Great Falls, these are just some pictures of it. These are actual his stuff there, his hat, coat. It's located out back of the Methodist Church, downtown First Methodist Church. And they used to use a lot of Sunday school classes and stuff there, but he stayed there when he was in Great Falls. And so they have gone and found as much as they could from that era and put it there and refinished it. There's his steamer trunk and suitcase that he traveled with. So they managed to come up with a lot of things like that. So if you're in Great Falls in the summer months when they're doing it, it's worth your time to stop by, and they do have tours arranged at various times. And the organ came up on the steamboat to Fort Benton and got off and was traveled around various churches around the north central Montana, and they ended up with it eventually and refurbished it. So anyway, so where's the history of Chinook, Montana's United Methodist Church? Well, there's what it looked like 10 years ago. Some changes, most notably out front. And Bob and Linda can probably mention how some of that came about. But the history of this church is really the history of the churches here in Chinook in many ways. The longtime churches in Chinook, we can all probably find some of the same cycles in it. 1889, they started doing informal house worship in people's homes. A group of people figured out they were Methodists. And then around this time, Jacob Mills, that was the pastor in Great Falls, came up and started helping organize them. And so about that time, they decided they wanted to be a congregation. What makes it more interesting, in 1889, annual conference was in Helena. And the featured speaker was a fellow for what's now called the General Board of Discipleship, a guy by the name of W.A. Spencer. Does that name sound familiar? You just sang a song by him. Harvest Time. He wrote Harvest Time. He was on the train. In those days, the train came all the way from Helena up to Havre and then went east, and he was taking the train back. It had to stop in Chinook for water and fuel, about an hour break. And so he came up and led the first formal worship here of Methodist in Chinook. And so he actually preached in Chinook before Brother Van did. So about this time was when Brother Van was appointed to supervise the Great Falls district, which went all the way over to Glasgow. Not a big surprise. And in 1890, Brother Van first preached the first time here in Chinook. Still no church. They were meeting oftentimes over at City Hall in those days and in people's homes. And 1891, in March, is when the church was formally organized. That was the official dedication date, and 11 members were accepted that day. So, and Brother Van was doing that. And so we move into the 1890s. That was a huge time for the church. That's when the building, the sanctuary, was built, which was only this part here from the entryway this way. The windows were not stained glass. Those came later. It was just glass windows. In the days before they got the glass, they did, maybe you've done this in grade school, you took crepe, that sort of semi-transparent colored crepe paper, and they would put those up on the windows at various times so that you had the sunlight coming through with a similar effect. And then building of the church starts. In 1893, the cornerstone was laid. Brother Van was involved with that. And so there were some nails out here that were pounded by Brother Van on the building, as well as the cornerstone. And $1,800 was raised for the building of this building. The contractor was Peter Denny. Some of you may know his daughter, Margaret Aker, that passed away about 20 years ago. So that's how some of the various dedications to Margaret Aker came about. And in August of 1896, the church was actually fully dedicated. So go to that. And then in this time, the pastor, most of the pastors over the years were served for about 2 years, 1 or 2 years. But they started doing services elsewhere besides Chinook. In 1896, the pastor here was going down to Fort Belknap and having services down there and in Harlem. So Saturday night at 7 o'clock, he was in Harlem. 10:30, he was also in Harlem. And so it was afternoon services here in Chinook. Then in 97, he added services at Paradise Valley School, Chinook, Clear Creek, and Lloyd. And this is all pre-automobile. So some of those you could take the train, but most of them is hop on a horse or get in a wagon and go. In 1898, the services were being held in the Flinders family home, wherever that was. Maddox, which I found out is actually the Hungry Hollow location. And eventually they actually built a log building out there at Lloyd and Cleveland. And then 1899, the big schism happened. No, actually what happened was the Presbyterians organized and formed their own congregation. And so in 1899 when they left, there was a huge farewell service here for the Presbyterians as they went to found their own congregation. And then we move into the 20th century. Well, here's some of the things that were around at the beginning. You know, the original altar, it's still functioning as an altar, because anytime we've had church over in the other building, we pull it out. Here's the artifact that's probably the most amazing. This, sadly, the one thing that didn't happen, they didn't inscribe the Bible when it was donated. All we know is it's the original Bible that was given to this congregation when we opened. If you open the cover, you'll find it says dedicated to God and all that type of stuff with the dedication page. And where it has the date, it goes 18. So it's 1800s. So we know it's old. And it was on the altar here until 1993. So it put in over 100 years on the altar. It's the leather, cut leather and all that. It's pretty amazing. It's sitting on a little sort of pedestal down in the pastor's office. Well, Brother Van had his way, and so the pastor was appointed not to Chinook, but to the Bear Paw charge, and which meant officially that included the Maddox Church, which is out Hungry Hollow. Also, Ada and Lloyd was the first configuration of that. Where their church buildings, no, they met in folks' homes most of the time, these other places. 1903, they got new pews. That's these pews, the ones with the little things on the end here, the original pews to the church. So 1903, I don't know what they were sitting on before, but they got these in 1903. 1906, the charge changes again. Can you imagine this? Lloyd, Cleveland, Maddox, and Clear Creek Now, where on Clear Creek, it doesn't say. And occasionally, Warwick, Ada, and then the folks by the name of Rydell, wherever the Rydell family was here in Blaine County. A side note, in 1906, the Presbyterians got their first pews. And if you're sitting in a solid curved pew, that's those pews that we bought from the Presbyterians in 1968 for a huge sum of $200. There used to be a little hill out back of the church here. We graded that down in 1910 to make it flat back there. Also, the women of the church invited somebody to speak here in Chinook from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They had Carrie Nation here to speak. So a little interesting time. Then Brother Van was assigned to this district as the district superintendent, for example, in 1913-14, and there's 21 visits to the Chinook in that year, partially because the Regal family had given him a little room on the second floor of their home over here to use as an office. And so to make it a little easier, he would use Chinook as his halfway point on his travels along the High Line in north central Montana. So it was a little complicated then. This was what the church looked like in the early part of the 20th century. Notice there's no front steps to speak of.
No ramp.
No ramp, yes. And notice where the street is. The streets of Chinook, Mrs. West made this editorial comment. Any of you remember Mrs. West? She was known to make editorial comments. She said the streets of Chinook were graded down over the years, and actually there was a house over here, I think where the Western Bank or First Bank of Montana is, and somebody said all the streets should have some sort of relationship to some spot on the front steps of that church or that house. And so they graded all the streets down in relation to that. So eventually the church was raised a little bit for a while they built the basement downstairs. But it was a basement. It wasn't exposed like it is now. And so eventually the streets are graded down, the basement is then exposed, and we have the situation we have now. Here's the ladies of the church in 1905. Sadly, none of them are identified. We don't know who's who in it. Anybody who knew us passed away without information being passed on. 1919 is when Brother Van was here in town. He was staying at the Regal's home when he was stricken with his stroke. They note that the Junior League women, which was mostly the women of the churches here in town, would go over and serenade him in that fall, before he was moved to Great Falls, with his favorite hymns. And so, rather interesting thing. Now, I've never got this confirmed by any official sources, but Frank Sharples told me this was the Regal home. You may recognize this Shirley McKenzie's home. And it makes sense because it said he had his office in a sort of set-off section of the second floor, which, if I remember right, would be like that little room there. So anyway, and it also works when you hear that they were over there serenading him. So again, there's the sort of the summary of the early years of the church. Then in the 1920s, we have the basement completed. The cornerstone was moved from the original location, which never heard, to the wall, which eventually the cornerstone was moved out front. It's someplace in the marquee now. But, and then we're continuing with that. The services, the poor pastor in 1925, Fairview, which is out by where Roger Jurgensen lives now on Barney Olson, Zurich, and then the Smotherman home. And at that time, they were actually even having church services, Sunday school out at the New Hope area, which is also out that way. And they had 25 kids attending Sunday school out there. Tells you a little bit about how things have changed with the size of families and how many families there are out that area. In 1927, guess how many kids we had in church school here? In Sunday school?
50.
Higher.
Wow, really?
150.
Wow.
And I think it was similar numbers for a lot of the churches. But it was a boom. There was a lot of more families around here in with large numbers. And of course, in 1937, big change there. During the Depression, they raised the money, put in all these stained glass windows here. Now, they all are some of the founding members of the church here. I haven't counted up, but I wouldn't be surprised if you count the names here, they come close to 11. I know from Ed Wallner that Lewis Wilson and Mrs. Wilson are his grandparents, Gwen Wallner's parents, and they were founding charter members. And so that was why the Wallner family wanted to do the window over here so badly, was a continuation of the family tradition. And so the windows came in 1937. Interesting how, a lot of times we've thought, well, these windows were here from the beginning. They weren't. So the 40s and the 50s, the boom years for the population of Chinook, and also for the churches. In 1948, we had 258 members. And then they said 168 of them were active. Now, I don't know what the difference between active and inactive is in that definition. In 1948, the pastor, which was Reverend Dover, baptized 33 kids. That's a lot of baptisms. Sunday school attendance was averaging 120. 1952, the area where the piano is was built, and if you remember right, that used to be what was called the choir loft. And that's also the reason why Julie and Linda, everybody that plays piano up there, freezes, is because they couldn't put the heat vent over there because it would come up into a hollow space. So, we find out all sorts of things. And then, in the 50s is also when they start raising funds for Wallner Hall. The original budget for Wallner Hall, anybody know that one? $40,000. Some of it was just because they did it, almost all the labor was done by individuals. Electrical work was donated. Interestingly enough, Morris Harshman was not the electrician that wired Wallner Hall. It was another member. That's why, if you knew Morris, he cussed and discussed that 9-volt wiring system over there for years. He got overruled. Morris was the overall foreman for the building project. And by 1958, they were building had broke ground and were starting on Wallner Hall. And it was dedicated in 1960. Bishop Phillips came up along with Reverend Dover, came back for the dedication. So pretty interesting thing. Some of the changes in the Wallner, in the sanctuary over the years. Well, 1913 we had the addition put on over here. There were wooden folding doors that went across. What's interesting, nobody remembers what happened to them. Somebody just got rid of them. Then in the 1980s, the banners were made. Sarah Baird did the harvest time and read for the journey. I believe Linda helped Sarah with by water and spirit. Those were some of the changes. In the sanctuary, also you can't see it on the slide, but there's that blob up there, just not quite above me on the ceiling. That's courtesy of MYF. That's actually a giant spit wad. Years ago, when I was talking about this, I found Ron Reynolds, when Sandy was here, told me during the first school reunion, all-class reunion, they had the church open, which we do normally during all-class reunions. And he came in, and there was two older women in here sitting, giggling, and pointing. And he found out they had MYF in here in those days, of course. And they were typical high school kids, junior high. Somehow or another, a paper towel got made into a giant spitball. And when Pastor Dover was not looking, up and it stuck. Well, the painters over the years have painted over it too, thinking it had some sort of function, not knowing, so it was there. Then, at the first couple of years later, when Spike and Mitzi Brust moved back to town, I was showing this and speaking about it, and Spike raised his hand, says, "I know who did that." It was Spike's sister. His sister was one of the two girls. He told me who the other one was, but didn't ring. So we had that. In 1988, we did the renovation of the building here. Barb Ranstrom actually worked for hours, days, working on the windows, actually salvaging them, because it turned out they had been misinstalled, and there's some rods that hold the window up that hadn't been installed, and so the weight of the windows, they were actually buckling, and so the windows are there because of Barb finding that out. The carpet was put in, it was repainted. The area up in front behind the altar was done later. If you like or dislike the green, the two different shades we've had, blame Lita Campbell. That was her. And Lori. So, some notable things. 1954, they had Cradle Roll Sunday. Let's see. There's one person present that's in this photo, Lori Sue. There's Lori Sue right there. She is.
There's the Breast Girls.
Yeah, the Breast Girls.
And the Butlers and the
Danny Harshman. Morris Harshman, right there. Pauline. Frankie and Johnny Overcast. So those are some of the folks that are still around. So gives you an idea too. Baby boom here in Chinook, 1954. And that picture is over in Walner Hall. 1971 was when we got that little thing in the marquee out front that designates us as a historical site. What does that mean? We are the only church that was built by Brother Van that's still being used in the same, it's the longest time going. Kids Corner, 1977, became a ministry of this congregation. So it's been going quite a number of years now. 88, the restoration. 1994, some of you remember when we remodeled the basement over Walner Hall for the Sunday school. We now have, the preschool is down there, Funshine is down there, but it used to have another 3 classrooms downstairs. We had that, it was horribly dark building down there. And there was a shuffleboard in the tile down there, as everybody did in those years. The metal ceiling was added after a fact in 1905. And I attempted to find that thing. I'm going to try to take another photo. About 15 years ago, we added something out front, and that's with this sculpture. That was donated by Jolynn Anderson, Betty Sprinkle's daughter, Maida McCartney's granddaughter. It was this little perspective on the church over the years. You can the outside, when we did the remodel of the church, we also did some work on the outside, and that's because if you remember, the concrete was peeling and sort of a faded green color at one time. And there's a close-up of the Good Shepherd. Marvin Edwards did the installation on it and made it so it couldn't get stolen. Because that was one of the concerns we had, because it wasn't terribly heavy. The sanctuary gives you some, it's one of the neat things about this place is it's when the sunlight is out, it gets so bright, cameras can't catch the effects through the stained glass like we have this morning. And the north side, one of the things in the renovation that happened, if you remember, is we turned the pews towards the front so that people were actually facing the pastor when they were speaking, or the front of the church. Before, they were facing the wall. You had a great view of the wall, and you had to crank your head to the front. And also the other thing, we made it handicapped accessible in the back, because used to be the pews went over almost and touched that wall. So going around was a rather difficult thing to get over to the north side. So it changed the perspective to that from the addition. There's some of the various stained glass windows. This, when people come to visit that grew up here in this church, this is what they ask about. Where is the little church? And I have been told numerous times when we repainted it back in the late 80s, we did it wrong. The windows are supposed to be red. The trim is supposed to be red. I don't remember it, but to some of them that grew up, that was what they say. And how many times have many of you sat down there and run quarters, nickels, dimes, pennies through that? Every kid figures out real quick, you pull out the steps, you can get the money out, and you can run it through again. So, again, some of the banners we have here. Also something that people remark upon when they come here is these being very unique. The cross on the Wallner Hall, the cross and flame, courtesy of Wes Baird and Darrell Thackeray. Darrell Thackeray's automotive classes spent weeks getting that red. They called it the flame from hell. Because Darrell wanted it that red, and it didn't get it. So this is the remodel, what it looked like afterwards downstairs. And I think that was the only year that it was set up this way. We've had rowboats down there and all sorts of various setups. Chrissy and Casey could tell you about the fun Scott and Dennis had about getting that boat downstairs. That was rather interesting. Wallner Hall, the tapestry there at the far end, donated, Amy Van Sand and her sisters donated that. One of them did that, the latch hook. Lita Campbell did these etchings on the windows there over in Wallner Hall during the remodel. Just general information. Folks who attended this church that have gone into ministry. The first several, C.N. Hurst, Terrell Newby, Harold Nelson, I have no idea where they served. They didn't serve in this area, but they did go into ministry. Dwight Harshman served in the Yellowstone Annual Conference throughout Montana and then retired to Havre. Bob Lind went into the ministry, and one of the churches he served was down in Glasgow. He left the ministry for a number of years, went back and got his PhD and taught in the extension service down at MSU for quite a number of years. And me, and then his son I have there just because he had the Chinook connection. He was born here in Chinook and went into it. And he's retiring from the ministry down in the Desert Southwest Conference in Phoenix this year. So we've had a few. Of course, I'm not seeing it here, but whoops. The Brother Van experience, my sources, Mrs. West. The book is hand-typed. It's in the back on the Chinook Methodist, 1865 to 1989. Various folks in the church. A lot of folks that have passed away the last few years were sources of the information for me. And for whatever reason, my harvest time thing didn't show up on this slide. But we played it earlier and sang it. So, questions? I have no answers, though. Lori.
When did Boiler Hall burn?
1968, I believe, is when it was. Does that sound right, Bob?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was in the late 60s. Yeah, if you go up in the attic, and you spend much time up there, you come down with soot. Because Danny Harshman said when he was blowing in the insulation, he got pretty dirty up there. And Mickey Haney, when he replaced and hooked up the cross on the front a few years ago, said, yeah, you can still see the soot on the rafters and stuff.
Didn't we have a parsonage right next door?
Yes, I didn't do the parsonages. Yes, that we had two houses. The first parsonage was right here where the drive comes up. You used to be able to see the steps.
Yeah.
And then they bought the house next door at one time, what Umsteads owned, that Allie Mae Uehara, Cecil owns it now. And then in the late 60s when they bought the house down there on Illinois Street, yeah. Yeah, and the other thing, if you go over to look at the records, when a few years ago we had for insurances and stuff like that, we had to get the official records from the courthouse about the property descriptions and all that. You go over in those first books, which are copied from Choteau County, of course, and the church fathers, these guys, were wheeling and dealing on land all over Chinook. There were at least 10 properties there between 1890 and 1910 that the church owned here around town. Most of them over here in this 3 or 4 block area, but there were lots that all over. What they were doing with it, I don't know, but you would see they have it and then show they got sold it a few months later. So I'm not sure if they were using it fundraise or what, but you know, it was a whole different era on some of these things. And but
Don't
yeah,
we still own land up north, or was that sold?
it was sold. Yeah, at one time, we had some land. We had mineral rights. Well, we still have mineral rights that were donated to the church. We get some from the Reeves Van Sant. No. Oh, his last name's Reeves. Amy Van Sand's father. He was an oil and gas speculator, and when his wife, Amy's mother, passed away, we got some mineral rights. Yeah, we've had some property that was donated to the church. Trustees were happy to get rid of a lot of it. Being in the landlord business as a church is not easy. So, Bob, I know, had something he wanted to share.
It's not in order.
Oh, well, I'm not in order either. As you notice, I'm still organizing this.
I know that Lori was going to a lot of this. And Might be, I'm not the oldest person here. There's someone here that's old, there's several. Well, I remember the church when didn't have the steps. And in the back of the church were great big pine trees. And it had a wall, cement wall, we walked along, about so high. But I can remember going and playing back there. I was pretty young. I was born in 1947, so I remember things from the 50s that impressed me as I grew up. I remember the folding doors here. I don't know where they went, but they went somewhere. They were huge though. I mean, they went from the floor up there and they folded back against that wall. The names on the stained glass windows, I grew up looking at the names, wondering who those people were. And I still remember, I still wonder who they were and what they gave to the church. Obviously gave something more than others. I don't know where the windows were made, but I'm sure they were commissioned somewhere. Well, when we came to church, we dressed up. If you were a man in our church, you had on a suit and tie. And if you were a kid, you probably had on a suit and tie too. That's the way we came to church every Sunday. And I suppose I'm a Methodist, so why am I a Methodist? Well, my one reason is that my mother's father was a Methodist minister. Actually married my parents up in Skokie. Getting dressed, I'm thinking about Easter Sunday, we'd have sunrise service. We got it at sunrise service and it was at 6 o'clock in the morning.
And then breakfast.
And we had a breakfast, that's right. And then if you were my age, then after that you went to Sunday school. And after you went to Sunday school, then you went to church with your parents. And it was a big deal. Sunrise or Easter was a big deal in our families also when you got family pictures taken because everybody was dressed up. Girls I had 3 sisters. The girls were dressed up in their fancy new dresses.
Easter bonnets
Yeah.
and your purse and your white patent leather shoes.
Lori remembers.
Yeah.
Lori's not as old as me.
Not quite.
No, but our brother, David, was on my age. We grew up together. I'm thinking about Lori and David. They had the magnificent voices. And I'm sure Lori still does, but can't get her to sing anymore. But she is a great singer. I'm thinking about music too. I'm thinking, did your mother play the piano and the organ here in the church?
Forever.
Yeah.
But there's so many others that also did.
Don't I remember your mother when I was young? And I believe she played the organ.
She did.
And she could make the chimes up here work.
Those were bought by my grandmother's memorial money. Stella Belcher.
As far as I know, the chimes still work.
Yes, they do.
Somebody knows how to do it. The challenge for anybody who wants to figure that out.
There's a little switch there.
Is there?
Yeah.
On this end.
Reverend Dover, of course, when I grew up, Reverend Dover was the minister. I thought he was going to be a minister forever. Well, he was here from when I was born, I suppose, till I was 12 years old. And so I can remember up here pounding on the pulpit and yelling at us. We had more fire and brimstone. He could be, yes, he could. He didn't sleep then.
He drove truck for us during harvest and he rolled the truck.
Yeah. Martin would have stayed away.
Maybe.
Oh, well. The choir got to stand over there. I actually sang in the choir, probably with Lori. And with my parents, there are probably more people in the choir than sitting in church here today. It was a full blown deal.
And we had a junior choir too.
I said, yeah, okay. I was probably in the choir, you were in the junior choir. Oh, what else can I remember that little church. I put a lot of pennies in that little church. And pulled out the little drawer, put the pennies back in again. Yep. And it did sit over in Walter Hall for a while. It's still there? Okay. I remember it being orange. I could be wrong, anyway.
It's changed.
Ernie Wallner, I remember Ernie Wallner, he owned a furniture store. But I remember him because I remember when he passed away, suddenly, I think I was a freshman in high school, and felt so bad for Eddie Wallner, who was a year older than me. And I remember how sorrowful that was. I mentioned that my mother's father, name was Rupert McCann, and they're buried out here in the cemetery by my parents. But the thing I remember is the Three Bears sermon. Some of you may remember that sermon about the three bears. Maybe Linda can give that someday.
I have a copy.
There you go.
I did it at their 60th wedding anniversary happened to be on the same day, a Sunday.
Oh, right. Yeah,
And your sister, Kitty, said I should do it.
yeah. Well, it's been given several times. It's an interesting sermon about the three bears. It came about because my mother asked my grandfather why he never gave a sermon about the three bears. So he did. So if you ever get a chance to hear it, then it's a good sermon. I remember being confirmed in the church, probably when I was in high school or younger, in quote junior high or somewhere. I think Reverend Johnson was the minister then. Mrs. Blackwood. Remember Mrs. Blackwood? I thought she was going to teach Sunday school forever too. I think she probably did until she passed away. In my mind, she always wore black.
She did. Or navy.
Mrs. Blackwood.
Navy.
Yeah. That's how I learned the song, Jesus Loves Me. Learning that. Now, we had Sunday school in the basement of the church when I was little. And they also had dinners down there. There was a kitchen back in the sun. Had the old wood coal stove back there. And the men, I can remember the men, cooking roast and had a wild game. Used to have a wild game dinner after hunting season. I can remember we had moose and bear and deer and these people went out and got all kinds of animals. What else do you remember, Laurie?
Oh, I remember a lot with the music. When people were here, this church rocked.
Yep.
We had Bob Armstrong that had an absolutely gorgeous voice. My brother and I sang in the choirs, solos, duets. Mother made us. And then I remember some of the different people. Where Kevin is right now was Mom Harshman's seat. You don't sit in that seat. And if you talk too long, she got up and left. She had to get her hand. Well, is it Florence where,
The diamonds.
where Julie's sitting and she had lots of diamonds on her finger and the sun would come in and she'd play those diamonds in the light all through the service. We had Mildred. Oh God, what was her name? No,
Rivera.
Rivera. And Florence Nutter always sat right in front of where Ralph is. And we sat in this pew forever.
Yeah.
But the W, that,
Yeah.
Village.
And then Roberta West, was she in the back row or she where Sheree was?
I remember sitting up here.
Oh, and she was in the back whenever I was, remembered her.
And he was
She
a-
was
He
great.
was crippled and, but he got in and out and did his thing.
Yeah, she was cranky. She didn't like what you're doing, she'd tell you.
Yes, if you read through the history book, she makes editorial comments about pastors. You can tell which pastor she liked and which she didn't like. She did not like pastors doing things from the pulpit that were different. Bob Baker got a lot of grief over waiving the bills that one time he did the fundraising where they gave everybody $50 or $100 bills to go out and raise money with.
No, it was $10,
Or $10 bill.
10 or 20.
Yeah.
And you had to make as much money as you could. And I know my mother made bread. And we had people coming all over for mother's bread.
So, yeah.
We had Maida McCarthy from the Chinook.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, Maida. And Betty Sprinkle.
Yeah, don't do a new hymn that's different with Betty, because she'd stop you in the middle to ask you how to sing it.
Mildred Downey.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, some of those people taught church school for me when I was in charge. I mean, Nina would come and play, even then, in Walnut Hall. And then she had her sister Bessie here. And Bessie got sick. Nina took care of her, and Nina always said the caretaker goes before the person they're taking care of sometimes. That's such a hard word. But anyway, she played, and then Linda Luckett came and played for us. And we had all of these people were church school teachers, and all of us were.
Well,
And we had 60 kids.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
Wednesdays.
we had Amy Van Sant
Yeah.
and Freddie, her son.
But he's still playing,
Yeah.
not for church, but he's playing professionally.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, he plays a lot in Branson.
Another thing I remember, Zurich Park, we had a picnic there every summer. We had a lot of people there. What I remember was I was younger, the creek actually flowed through there when I was young, and there was they eventually built a walk across the creek, so we didn't have to wade through to get over to the other side. We climbed the hill so we could slide down it on our back in the dirt. And they could put an ice cream, that's what I remember. Great big tubes, they were big round cylinders wrapped in canvas and insulation. And I suppose it had dry ice in it. And when it came time, and us kids were all in line to get our cup of ice cream. So that was a big deal every summer, and there was a sermon, not in the building, but there was I don't know if that's still happening,
No, they tore down.
but that's all gone. Well, there was a raised area that was open, had a wall around it, steps going up one side, and it's probably, well, be big enough for a dance floor, or probably 100 square feet or something. Oh, anyway, those are some things I remember. You must remember some things.
Well, I do.
Sunday school, I don't remember about Sunday school.
I just remember those wonderful, huge Christmas programs that our kids were all involved in, and we were all Sunday school teachers as parents. Cherie and Tree Armstrong first, and then Cherie did all the organizing, and they were huge with the big stage over at Walter Hall, and everybody came. We had snacks afterwards. Our kids have
Wonderful.
wonderful memories of that.
Thank you,
There were lots
Jack.
of kids.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Blake.
Yeah, Blake is recording this, and the thing at the museum will be recorded as well. And